So we continue our discussion of Dryden's An Essay of Dramatic Poesy. So we saw line 230 of the text. In the last class we saw that Lycidaeus says that he did not have a full definition of drama, but he has a description, kind of description of drama, which I explained to you in the earlier class, that logically description is a weak definition. So what is the description? A just and lively image of human nature, representing its passions and humors and the changes of fortune to which it is subject, for the delight and instruction of mankind. Since there are no definitions available in Aristotle or Horace, it appears to be very difficult to provide a description of drama. And this attempt is kind of an approximation, but as the others in this conversation object, that this definition could also be a definition of epic poetry. So it does not make any distinction. So in scholastic terms, it is called differentia. That is the distinctive mark of something. Unless a differentia is mentioned, one cannot define anything properly, according to scholasticism. For example, the distinct mark of man, or the differentia of man, is that he is rational, or sometimes it is said that he can laugh. No other animal can laugh. No other animal is rational like man. So this kind of distinction or differentia was important. But as we look at this definition, a just and lively image of human nature, which suggests that it is an image, or it is an imagined creation or reflection, representing its passions and humors and the changes of fortune. Now these are represented in also narrative poems, passions, humors, changes of fortune. Also in a tragedy we find this. So here, whether it is a tragedy, whether it is drama, whether it is epic poem, it is not clear. And the final part of the definition, for the delight and instruction of mankind, that we recognize as the Aristotelian, Horatian definition of literature as something which is both useful and entertaining. But these are the goals of literature in general, not only of drama. This definition, though Crates raised a logical objection against it, that it was only a genere and fine, and so not altogether perfect. Now, we may remember that Crates represented the ancients. Therefore, he would naturally raise an object to such a definition. He says that this definition only gives us the generic definition, literature as a genre, but not any subgeneric or definition of drama. The drama is a subgenre of literature. So here, genre does not mean genre, because we use the word genre in literature to suggest different kinds of literature, like drama, poetry, prose, and so on. Here, genre means the Latin genus. So in logic, the two terms genus and species were used. So under every genus there would be species. Okay. So literature is the genus, and the genres like epic, drama, tragedy, and so on, these are the species. So this definition gives only the genus, and Fine means end or goal. So we have seen the last part of the definition, delight and instruction. So not altogether perfect. Was yet well received by the rest, and after they had given order to the watermen to turn their barge and row softly, that they might take the cool of the evening in their return, Crates, being desired by the company to begin, spoke on behalf of the ancients in this manner. Now we have long deliberation, or you may say discussion of a drama from the point of view of the ancients, and Crates represents this point of view. What are the points of view represented in this conversation? Let us remember once again. The ancient point of view represented by Crates, the modern point of view represented by Eugenius, the Francophile point of view represented by Lycidaeus, and the perhaps balanced and judicious point of view represented by Neander of Dryden. So the purpose is to present simultaneously 4 different points of view on the question of drama, and let the reader judge for himself. If confidence presage a victory, Eugenius in his own opinion has already triumphed over the ancients. Eugenius already spoke about the moderns and how the moderns excel the ancients and so on. Crates says that it is only confidence that is there in Eugenius's argument. The confidence that the moderns excel the ancients, but there is no proof. There is no evidence. Nothing seems more easy to him than to overcome those whom it is our greatest praise to have imitated well. He reminds the audience of the Renaissance theory of imitation, that the purpose of any writer is to imitate the ancient models well. So how far we have been able to do that, that has not been discussed in any detail. For we do not only build upon their foundations, but by their models. The ancient writers are our models. Dramatic poesy had time enough, reckoning from Thespis, who first invented it, to Aristophanes, referring to Greek drama. Thespis is supposed to be the inventor of drama, from which we have the term thespian. So when we refer to some famous theatre personality, we call him a thespian. And then Aristophanes, among the Greeks, later dramatist, to be born, to grow up and to flourish in maturity. So you know that in the history of Greek drama we have old comedy, new comedy, some stages of development. So even ancient drama has a history. It was born, it grew up, and it developed to maturity. It has been observed of arts and sciences that in one and the same century they have arrived to great perfection. And no wonder, since every age has a kind of universal genius which inclines those that live in it to some particular studies. So arts and sciences develop simultaneously in an age, and every age has a particular genius of its own. Here genius means the guiding spirit, and not an individual genius. So in every age particular studies are emphasized and particular studies develop. The work then being pushed on by many hands must of necessity go forward. Is it not evident in these last 100 years, when the study of philosophy has been the business of all the virtuosi in Christendom, that almost a new nature has been revealed to us? Here philosophy means science, natural science, experimental science. So in the 17th century, a lot of path-breaking discoveries were being made in sciences that gave birth to modern science. And therefore, in the 17th century, one saw the earlier ancient, medieval and ancient form of knowledge being superseded by a new form of knowledge, and experimental science, natural science becoming more and more important. And therefore, Crichton says that more errors of the school have been detected, more useful experiments in philosophy have been made, more noble secrets in optics, medicine, anatomy, astronomy discovered than in all those credulous and doting ages from Aristotle to us. Errors of the school. Here the word school refers to scholasticism. So as you know that scholasticism was the method of learning in the ancient period up to the and the medieval period up to the 16th century or we may say 15th century. Scholasticism was very strong, and in the 16th century scholasticism and humanism could be seen side by side. So the rise of the new kind of studies, humanistic studies, at the same time the rise of scientific studies, modern science, natural science, can be seen in the 16th century. The older scholastic studies that depended upon Aristotelian logic, the studies of the schoolmen, that was superseded by these modern studies. So Crichton says that in such natural sciences as optics, medicine, anatomy and astronomy, many discoveries have been made. So you know that the telescope was discovered as a result of development in optics, and Milton describes Galileo, the Tuscan artist, with his optic glass or his telescope looking at the moon. So new discoveries in astronomy were possible because of this. Anatomy made a lot of progress because dissections on human corpses were practiced in the 16th century. Robert Boyle discovered the theory of the circulation of blood. So a lot of developments in medicine and anatomy were also made. So the past age, the scholastic age, and the studies dependent upon Aristotelian logic, deductive logic, gave place to modern science, which depended upon experimentation and inductive logic as proposed by Francis Bacon. So true it is that nothing spreads more fast than science when rightly and generally cultivated. Add to this the more than common emulation that was in those times of writing well, which though it be found in all ages and all persons that pretend to the same reputation, yet poesy being then in more esteem than now it is, had greater honours decreed to the professors. So the difference between the ancient period and the modern period is that in ancient period poetry had greater honour, and the professors of poetry means those who practiced poetry, the poets, they had greater honour in the ancient period. And consequently the rivalship was more high between them. They had judges ordained to decide their merit and prizes to reward it. He is referring to the ancient practice of competition among poets, and the winner would be decorated with a laurel crown. So there were judges, there were competitions, there were methods of honoring the poets who did well. And historians have been diligent to record of Aeschylus, Euripides, Sophocles, Lycophron and the rest of them, both who they were that vanquished in these wars of the theatre, and how often they were crowned. So historians of literature, of poetry have recorded the people who were defeated in these competitions as well as those who were winners. While the Asian kings and Grecian commonwealths scarce afforded them a noble subject than the unmanly luxuries of a debauched court, or giddy intrigues of a factious city. Bradley here says Theocritus that often in ancient literature, Asian kings or Greek commonwealths, Greek states were depicted as having a debauched court or intrigues of a factious city. And then he refers to the writing by Roman poet Paterculus, whose book Historia Romana, from which he quotes. These lines are taken from his book Historia Romana. Alit emulatio ingenia et nunc invidia nunc admiratio incitationem accendit. The lines have been translated by Dryden himself. Emulation is the spur of wit, and sometimes envy, sometimes admiration quickens our endeavor. Emulation means imitation. It is the spur of wit, that is, poets do better when they imitate somebody, and they are motivated either by the envy of his model, the skill of his model, or by admiration, and tries to imitate. But now, since the rewards of honor are taken away, that virtuous emulation is turned into direct malice. So now, since there are no more rewards given to poets, so we tend to be envious or malicious against the ancient models. Yet so slothful that it contents itself to condemn and cry down others without attempting to do better. So his argument is that it is not sufficient if you cry down the ancients and just shout that the moderns have performed better than the ancients. It is a reputation too unprofitable to take the necessary pains for it. That is, the profession of poetry has become unprofitable now, and therefore nobody would take a lot of pains, that is, make a lot of effort to write well, because there are no rewards to be obtained these days. Yet, wishing they had it, that desire is incitement enough to hinder others from it. So, the envious poets, they kind of hinder others from being true poets, because they do not have the rewards, so they are envious of others. And this, in short, Eugenius, is the reason why you have now so few good poets. So he comes to this kind of assertion that in modern times, Eugenius, even though you say that modern poets have excelled the ancients, there are very few good poets to be found today. And so many severe judges. Certainly, to imitate the ancients well, much labor and long study is required, which pains I have already shown our poets would want encouragement to take. That is, the poets need some incentive for doing such hard work, if yet they had ability to go through the work. That is, assuming that they had the talent to write good poetry. Those ancients have been faithful imitators and wise observers of that nature which is so torn and ill represented in our plays. So in modern plays we find that nature is not represented very well, unlike ancient plays. They have handed down to us a perfect resemblance of her, that is the ancients, which we, like ill copiers, neglecting to look on, have rendered monstrous and disfigured. So they have given us a perfect copy of nature, of the world in their poetry, but we are ill copiers, that is, we copy very badly, and the results of our work is monstrous. But that you may know how much you are indebted to those your masters, and be ashamed to have so ill requited them. I must remember you that all the rules by which we practice the drama at this day were delivered to us from the observations which Aristotle made of those poets who either lived before him or were his contemporaries. So he says that Eugenius, in order that you can appreciate the ancients and their hard work, I have to remind you about the rules of writing poetry which Aristotle had given. Here the word remember means remind. So I have to remind you that Aristotle framed these rules by observing or studying his predecessors and contemporaries. And they were all ancient poets, ancient dramatists. So the rules by which he practiced the drama at this day, either such as relate to the justness and symmetry of the plot, or the episodical ornaments such as descriptions, narrations and other beauties which are not essential to the play. So whether we focus on plot, which is the most important contribution by Aristotle, studying ancient tragedy, he laid down the rules of plot formation of tragedies. So whether we focus on plots or on such inessential elements, plot is the essential element, but decoration, narration, description, episodical ornament, these are inessential elements. Whether we focus on them, we have to remember that Aristotle made these rules by observing, by studying his predecessors and his contemporaries. We have added nothing of our own except we have the confidence to say our wit is better. So he challenges the modern point of view. He challenges Eugenius, who said that the moderns excel the ancients, by saying that we have not added anything to Aristotle's rules. We did not improve upon his rules. Yet we keep on saying that we do better than him, or better than the ancients, of which none boast in this our age, but such as understand not theirs. So those who boast of producing great works today, they do not understand their works. Of that book which Aristotle has left us, Peritis Poeticus, so this is reference to the Poetics of Aristotle, the Greek title. Horace, his Art of Poetry, is an excellent comment. So Horace's Art of Poetry, Ars Poetica, is an excellent comment on Aristotle's Poetics, and I believe restores to us that second book of his concerning comedy, which is wanting in him. So the Poetics that the Renaissance could lay their hands on, and that we still have, is a discussion of tragedy, but the second part of the book was supposed to be discussion of comedy and epic, but this part was never found. So Clytus says that in Horace we find, perhaps through Horace, the comments on comedy and epic as well. Out of these two have been extracted the famous rules which the French call the Trois Unités, or the three unities. So the neoclassical rules of drama, and the French neoclassical critics, here Dryden is alluding to Corneille, the French dramatist and critic. Corneille talks about the three unities. Now you know that Corneille was a 17th century French dramatist, but the laws of the three unities were actually propounded by the Italian 16th century Italian neoclassical critic Castelvetro. But Dryden does not mention him because Dryden's age was directly influenced by the French critics, French writers. So here we have a note on this, on Clytus's comment. Aristotle was not responsible for legislating on the three unities. He insisted on the importance of the unity of action and mentioned the desirability of restricting the time scale of a play to approximately, quotation, a single revolution of the sun, but said nothing of the unity of place. Castelvetro, in his translation of the Poetics, 1570, was the first to extract the three unities, thereby initiating a tradition which was not effectively challenged until Samuel Johnson's preface to Shakespeare in 1755. Dryden's French term comes from Corneille's Discours des Trois Unités, published in 1660. I am writing the name of Corneille's books. Discours des Trois Unités, 1660. And this essay by Dryden was written in 1668. So we may say that Dryden was more or less up to date because he is referring to a book of criticism which was published 8 years back. Watson points out that this is the first recorded application of the word unity to the rules. That is, Corneille applies the word unity to the rules of drama. So when we finish reading Titus's discussion of ancient drama and the three unities, then we more or less know about the neoclassical three unities at some length. So here Titus will explain the unities one after another. But it is important that as modern readers we remember that Aristotle did not speak of the unity of place. About the unity of time, he only spoke of single revolution of the sun, which the Italian critics sometimes explain as 12 hours, at other times as 24 hours. So Aristotle basically spoke about the unity of action. The unity of time they comprehend in 24 hours, the compass of a natural day, or as near it as can be contrived. They comprehend. Who are they? The French. And the reason of it is obvious to everyone that the time of the feigned action or fable of the play should be proportioned as near as can be to the duration of the time in which it is represented. Now, you may imagine that the French neoclassical critics were kind of mechanical in this conception. Even if the fictitious or fictive action of a play is 24 hours or 12 hours, that action cannot be represented in a performance which cannot be more than 2 hours. So there are bound to be compression, there are bound to be some kind of symbolic interpretation of time in a performance. So the attempt to be natural or to suggest that the drama interprets time naturally as the exact time during which the action can take place, that is a kind of mechanical interpretation. So Dryden says the reason why the French did it because the action of a play should be such which can happen in the scope of in the span of 12 or 24 hours, which can be theatrically represented. You cannot theatrically represent longer spans. You cannot represent years. So when romantic writers like Shakespeare would represent a gap of 16 years in his play, it would mean that he would assume that the audience is able to imaginatively understand that 16 years have passed in between the two actions on the stage. So this is not therefore a naturalistic attempt at the representation of any action. By definition it is a kind of symbolic representation. But in the neoclassical school there was this lingering attempt of representing time naturalistically. Since therefore all plays are acted on the theatre in a space of time much within the compass of 24 hours, that play is to be thought the nearest imitation of nature, whose plot or action is confined within that time. And by the same rule which concludes this general proportion of time, it follows that all the parts of it are, as near as may be, to be equally subdivided. So if the dramatist is trying to represent naturalistic time, say 12 hours or 24 hours, then that time should also be proportionately represented in the performance in its subdivisions. So here Dryden is alluding to the 5 acts, the 5-act structure. So each act must represent a proportionate amount of time of that 24 hours, which means act division or subdivision in a play, the division of action, should be proportionate and logical. Namely, that one act take not up the supposed time of half a day, which is out of proportion to the rest, since the other 4 are then to be straightened within the compass of the remaining half. So if the dramatist represents some action that takes place in half of the day, in one act, then the rest of the day, rest half of the day, has to be presented within all 4 remaining acts, which would be very unnatural. For it is unnatural that one act, which being spoke or written is not longer than the rest, should be supposed longer by the audience. So actions which are not longer, if you represent them, such action in one act, if you represent the action of half of the day, then you are asking the audience to imagine that this action is very long. It is therefore the poet's duty to take care that no act should be imagined to exceed the time in which it is represented on the stage. So every act should represent a proportionate amount of time. So if the time is one whole day, then every act should represent 1/5 of that day, and that the intervals and inequalities of time is supposed to fall out between the acts. So the intervals should be understood by the audience to be outside the fictitious time. Whatever is presented during the intervals, that should not be accepted as being in the main action of the play or being part of the main action of the play, because then you are messing up the calculation of the representation of time in every act. This rule of time, how well it has been observed by the ancients, most of their plays will witness. That is, most of ancient plays prove the unity of time. You see them in their tragedies, wherein to follow this rule is certainly most difficult. It is very difficult, not easy at all, to represent the action on stage in tragedies, because tragedies often contain actions which would indicate something that happened many years back, the consequences of which are felt after so many years. But in drama, because of the rule of unity of time, you can represent actions of only 12 hours or 24 hours. From the you see them in their tragedies from the very beginning of their plays, falling close into that part of the story which they intend for the action or principal object of it. So since you cannot represent the entire story or the entire tragic action, you cannot believe that the entire tragic action takes place only in 12 hours. Therefore, the writers of tragedy make a selection. They represent only that part of the action which takes place at the climax and near the climax, and the previous action of the past years that action is narrated. So what Dryden is suggesting here, that writers of tragedy, they also follow the principle of in medias res, the Horatian principle of in medias res. That is, the action of the play begins from the middle of the story, from the middle of things, not from the very beginning, leaving the former part to be delivered by narration. So whatever actions took place in the past years, that is represented through narration, so that they set the audience, as it were, at the post where the race is to be concluded. So the audience can see only the last part of the race, or the last part of the story. They are posted very near the climax of the, leaving the, as it were, as the post where the race is to be concluded, and saving them the tedious expectation of seeing the poet set out and ride the beginning of the course. They suffer you not to behold him till he is in sight of the goal and just upon you. So narrating the story from the very beginning, or representing the action from the very beginning, would be tedious and would be impossible if you follow the unity of time. So the tragedian, the writer, represents this action only toward the end of the story. So this is Crates' discussion of the unity of time. Then he comes to the second unity, or unity of place. The ancients meant by it that the scene ought to be continued through the play in the same place where it was laid in the beginning. The scene could not be changed according to the unity of place. For the stage on which it is represented being but one and the same place, it is unnatural to conceive it as many. So here also you see a kind of mechanical, thinking. That since all action is represented on a stage which is but one place, so the action of the drama also must take place in only one place, which denies the possibility of the actors imagining different places, and those far distant from one another. So places distant from one another would not be represented in ancient tragedy. I will not deny, but by the variation of painted scenes, the fancy may sometimes imagine it several places, which was a practice in the 16th century Elizabethan Jacobean drama, that painted scenes were used to depict, say, London or Venice. So Dryden says that I do not deny that this is a possible course of action by which different places can be represented, which in these cases will contribute to its own deceit. So he considers this representation by painted scene as a deception. Yet it still carries the greater likelihood of truth if those places be supposed so near each other as in the same town or city. So even if you represent different places by painted scenes, you should represent places which are close to one another, as in the same town or the same city, not in different cities altogether or different countries. So what is the issue here? The issue here is that of verisimilitude. Verisimilitude means how far the representation in literature resembles reality. Veri comes from vera, which means truth. Similitude, similar. The adjective is very similar. That is close to truth. So in order to be very similar, or in order to have verisimilitude, one cannot represent different places or places distant from one another, which may all be comprehended under the larger denomination of one place, for a greater distance will bear no proportion to the shortness of time which is allotted in the acting to pass from one of them to another. So you see, the rule of unity of place is tied to the rule of unity of time, because every act, every scene is has an allotted time. So if you represent a character moving from one place to another distant place, then it will not be possible for the audience to imagine that in such a short time the character could pass from one place to another distant place. Therefore, it will not be very similar. For the observation of this, next to the ancients, the French are to be most commended. So after the Greeks and Romans, the French dramatists are to be praised for sticking to the rule of unity of place. They tie themselves so strictly to the unity of place that you never see in any of their plays a scene changed in the middle of an act. If the act begins in a garden, a street or chamber, it is ended in the same place. There is no scene change. All actions in an act take place in the same place. And that you may know it to be the same, the stage is so supplied with persons that it is never empty all the time. Scene change is not possible or is not made, which means that the scene must always be populated by characters. The scene will never be empty, because if there is a change of scene, then all the characters must leave the stage and the curtains will be drawn and the scene will be changed, and then again the next action will begin. But when scene change does not happen, then the stage cannot be left empty, which means that the dramatist must take care that when some characters leave, one character must be on the stage with whom another character would come and interact or speak, so that the action can continue. He who enters second has business with him who was on before, and before the second quits the stage, the third appears who has his business with him. So no character enters upon a stage which is empty. In order to keep the action very similar, credible, that the stage was never empty. This Corneille calls la liaison de scène, the continuity or joining of the scenes, and it is a good mark of a well-contrived play when all the persons are known to each other and every one of them has some affairs with all the rest. So this contrivance or this method that every character would come and speak to another character would suggest that the characters would all know one another in the play. And Dryden praises this practice as a practice that is convincing for the audience. Verisimilitude is maintained. The phrase which Dryden was later to render an order and connection of all the scenes, the French phrase liaison de scène, Dryden later translates it as an order and connection of all the scenes. He found this phrase in Discours de trois unités by Corneille, which I already mentioned. Here are some quotations from Corneille in French, which I am not reading. Right. So we have come to the end of the second unity, and it is the third unity which is actually the most important, the unity of action, because Aristotle emphasizes it, and Crates here goes on to speak about the unity of action. But before that, do you have any question regarding the first two unities? Well, it seems that we do not have any question. As for the third unity, which is that of action, the ancients meant no other by it than what the logicians do by their finis, the end or scope of any action. So the word finis is a Latin word which means end. The French word is fin. the end or scope of any action. So finish does not only mean the finishing of the finishing line, but it means the other sense of end. End means goal. That which is the first in intention and last in execution. So what was the intention of the play and whether it is executed fully becomes clear only when the play ends. So that is the finish or the scope. The scope of the play is fulfilled. The end of the play is obtained when it ends. So finish means both that the play ends, but also that its goal or its intention has been fulfilled. Now the poet is to aim at one great and complete action, to the carrying on of all things in his play, even the very obstacles, are to be subservient. And the reason of this is as evident as any of the former. So, what is the goal of the poet? To present a complete action. And in order to present this complete action, everything else that is presented in the play, any character, any action, everything is for this purpose. Subservient means that they serve this purpose, that the complete action is presented.